So medical device R&D can be an inspiring but also really intimidating field. So you've got like nanotechnology, robotics, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, all of the really incredible things that are actually right outside here as well. But there's another side of medical devices that I see. You've got bandages, and you've got tapes, and you've got scissors. So I consider myself a medical device archaeologist. I hunt out medical devices, I take them apart, understand how they work, how they don't work, what the components are inside, and then really what's going to happen once these get onto the unit. One of the first expeditions that I went on was to a Nicaraguan neonatal intensive care unit. And it was there that the director of the hospital was so excited to show the brand new ventilator that had just been donated from overseas. But what really caught my attention was the nurse working quietly in the background, hand cut, making these glasses for patients, the infant patients that were undergoing phototherapy treatment. This was amazing. They were incredibly elegant. But if you look at it, this dramatically improves a patient's quality of care. So when I think about medical device R&D, I see this entire underground stealth network of innovators. They're tinkering, they're cutting, they're modifying, they're working at the front lines of care, they're interfacing with patients directly, and they're really improving the quality of care. And often these innovators are nurses, and they're hacking into hospital supply closets. So what that means is they take the existing material that is at hand that they have either on the carts or in the closets, they modify it, they cut with it, they experiment it, and they create solutions that are more appropriate for the patients who are right in front of them. And a lot of times, they're also more affordable for these same patients as well. And so we call these nurses maker nurses. And in 2013, we launched a program with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to understand what exactly are these nurses making? And what ideas do they have for new devices? And who are they sharing this with? And are they getting rewarded for this? Or are they really just hiding in the backgrounds in a very stealth way? So let me tell you about one of the amazing nurses who we met. Her name is Roxana Reyna. Roxana Reyna is a wound care specialist and a NICU nurse from Corpus Christi, Texas. While you have systems across the country that are really investing heavily in IT and information systems to reduce operating costs across the hospital, Roxana saved her system $250,000 every year by using bandages and scissors and her nursing know-how to treat abdominal wall defects in infants. So her patients go home in 2 months instead of 4 months, and they have almost no risk of infection, which is incredible. So we met hundreds of nurses like Roxana who are not only making, they're inventing. Like these are new ways of delivering care, they're new ways of using the materials around them inside of the hospital. And so we studied what is the prototyping genome of these nurses? What are the materials that they use? How do they interact with each other? What are the dynamics? How do nurses express how they're using these tools and materials? So what you see at the top is that the orange chart is looking at when nurses had something they could hold in their hand, how did they describe it? And then the bottom chart is when nurses had an idea for something, how did they describe it? And so the very sparse yellow graph shows that without a representation of something physical to show what they were making, nurses were at a loss for describing it. They could identify the problem, but they had no prototyping vocabulary to talk through the mechanisms, the sensors, the actuators, the ways that they would solve this. We also looked, so we knew that nurses were making. We started to see these examples trickle in, but what was driving them to make? That to us was really going to tell, if we understand what's driving them, we can start to look at how do we sustain this, how do we grow this, and how do we amplify what nurses are doing. There's a lot of just-in-time manufacturing and design. The nurses will come up with these small microsystems and assembly lines almost of parts and materials. So they'll pre-make, they'll pre-cut materials that, for example, would be used to create a CPAP circuit for a patient in the neonatal intensive care unit. And they'll have the materials laid out, but it won't be until that patient arrives in the bed that they'll really be able to assemble and pull everything together because each patient is unique. And then there's just-in-time design where you have things that are materialized not necessarily into a brand new product, but into a protocol that you can show somebody else how to make. It's a recipe. There may be some modifications or it may just be assembly. hospitals that have undergone a shock to the system, whether it is a financial shock as bankruptcy or a natural disaster, have these incredible cultures of innovation and creativity. Because when your hospital is in the middle of a hurricane, like Hurricane Sandy that struck New York, you don't just need your leadership to be able to respond and know exactly what to do. You need your frontline staff to have both the permission and an understanding of how to solve these problems as they come up, because they are so acute and so real, and that those frontline staff are the ones who are standing between in front of the patients. So with all of this information, understanding what is being used and what is driving the making that is already happening, we stepped back and thought, what if we brought the tools from our lab at MIT into the hospital? And what if we built out programming so that when nurses and other frontline staff had these ideas, that they knew exactly how to solve it, or at least how to get started? And what if in the same way that you hit 8 on the elevator and hop up to the cardiovascular intensive care unit on the left, you also saw a hospital makerspace on the right, so that this making could happen directly at the point of care. So this past fall, that's exactly what we did. We launched the first hospital makerspace in the US, in a US hospital at UTMB Health in Galveston, Texas. And it includes a suite of materials that are maybe what you would see in a traditional makerspace. So you've got a 3D printer, you've got a laser cutter, you've got hand tools, but we've also built out an entire station for fluid management. Because unlike a community makerspace, the hospitals are managing a lot of fluids, IV lines and oxygen tanks and catheter lines. And so a lot of the ideas that come up or modifications are directly related to things that may be obscure in other fabrication facilities. And we really have worked to build this into the culture of the space as well. Because what we see is that staff don't have hours upon hours to come into the space and tinker endlessly. They come in prototyping sprints. Like Jason Schaeffer, who's the manager of the blocker burn unit at UTMB in Galveston. And Jason had this idea for creating a new system that would alleviate some of the workload of his nursing staff by augmenting the water flow. Instead of just a nurse having to stand above the bed bath, he wanted to be able to create a system that hose would plug into and would irrigate over the patient when they came in. So the critical care nurse could go on doing other things on the unit. So we showed him how to use the Dremel, we showed him how to use the 3D printer. And this was not something that our team took on, but instead we taught Jason how to actually make these CAD files. A week later, he tried it out on the unit. And guess what? It completely fell apart. The whole thing didn't work. But that was okay, because what you can see is that there was clearly no patient underneath it. But for Jason, he was able to go through this process of having an idea, making the prototype, plugging it in within a week's period of time, not because he lost sleep or gave up shifts, but because he was able to go in his free time to accelerate this idea and try it out. So a few versions later, this was actually 2 weeks later, and the system ran for 7 hours with the hose running through it. And there's still no patient underneath, but that's okay. We're getting there. We're getting closer. And it was through these incremental experiments and trials and 3D printing runs that Jason was able to get there in his free time, get his staff on board, and incredibly excited about how to move forward. So we build an operating system into the hospital. We don't just throw 3D printers in, because if you throw a 3D printer in, that's okay, that's interesting. But what you really need is the ability to coach and mentor staff like Jason who come into the space. And you need a way for them to incrementally move through the prototyping process. And you need a way for them to get rewarded as well. So we work with the Human Resources Department to actually build experiments like what Jason is doing into his professional advancement as a nurse at the hospital. We create prototyping vocabularies that make sense to the users of the makerspace. So instead of describing the 6-axis CNC or the carbide drill bit, we look at when staff come in, they want to know where are the things that cut or where are the things that measure. And then we can start to drill down on those individual components, but at a higher level we want people to dive in as quickly as possible, even if they have no experience with engineering or prototyping devices. And probably one of my favorite examples is when we have nurses from the pediatric intensive care unit, and they come down again in these short sprints of time before they're called back up to see their patients. So we'll get only so far in a conversation, whereas they're introducing these plastic cups that are used to cover IV ports so that kids don't pick at their IV lines. That's what's being demonstrated in this page. And so as we start to brainstorm how to improve their process of making this, they currently use scissors and tape, and then other ways to possibly improve the design, they get called away. But it's okay because so turn your head to the side. So we take advantage of something that's the pneumatic tubing system in the hospital. It's probably one of the reasons we like the most is we don't get to play with cool stuff like that at MIT. We've got an interdepartmental mail system that's not quite as real time. But this allows us to then continue working with the nursing staff or other frontline staff who come in, even if they're not on the unit as well, and just transfer back both the prototypes that are being made, the materials that might be able to address some solutions on the unit, and get that just-in-time feedback. And even if it didn't end up in the pediatric intensive care unit because we hit 351 instead of 350, there could be some serendipitous accident that's really exciting, because it turns out that the IV covers that work really well for pediatric patients are also really great for the geriatric patients who get equally as bored sitting in a hospital bed. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation, both on things that are modifications on things that were already happening, improvements on those, and also brand new ideas. Not necessarily something that is going to get patented as an invention, but a way to make a plastic sleeve that covers an IV line when patients go in the shower, or a sensor that goes on the bottom of a hand washing station in order to check how many people are actually washing their hands, or a sensor on a toilet so that they know when is a patient getting up if they're at high risk for falls, extremity warmers, 3D prints of DICOM files. And our vision is that we can move to something where physicians are not just prescribing medication, but they're prescribing prototypes that can come from this hospital MakerHealth space. And it's not just the nurses or even occupational therapists or respiratory therapists that will go into make the space to make these devices, but patients as well, because they are the ones who are innovating, I would say, even the most. So one of the great examples that we saw, this actually came from when we were doing the Maker Nurse study at South Shore Hospital in Weymouth, Massachusetts, but it wasn't from a nurse. This was from an account manager inside of the home care setting. So her brother has a feeding tube, and he wasn't able to feed himself. He had to wait for her to come home at the end of the day. And so what she did was went to the hardware store and got 2 plumbing bars and connected this to his IV pole, and then had a ring at the end that the feeding tube, that the syringe with the food could fit in, so that he, being able to use one hand, could actually feed himself instead of waiting for her to come home. So you have this incredible example that is $2 instead of $80 if you were to buy this as a commercial product. And then when we augmented it we introduced to Eileen Penny, the creator of this, a 3D printer, we're able to augment it to say, okay, well, here's what you could make something that's even more snug so that the syringe is a little bit sturdier. And then she had the idea of well, what if we can make different sizes attachments for different syringes? And so it's just this really incredible iteration and exploration into, patients as makers and caregivers as makers as well. And it's what we call making health, and it's a response to a system that has suppressed these frontline innovators and scared them to death with litigations, and really hidden these inklings of solutions that could dramatically change healthcare. And it turns out we're actually 100 years too late for this, because the American Journal of Nursing, and starting in the 1900s, used to publish all of these examples. These were specifically ones that were made by nurses, and they were things like baby aprons that could evacuate a NICU unit within less than 5 minutes, or you had color-coded syringes with tape. And when we quantified what these looked like, the frequency of these publications, we saw some really interesting trends. And you can start to pick out, if you overlay world events, why there may have been some spikes or dips or drops or huge, one of the favorite eras is the trading post of the 1950s. And so we want to bring that back. So we're bringing that back by introducing these physical spaces into hospitals, a website where the recipes can be shared in a very fluid way, so it's not just limited to even pneumatic tubings inside of a hospital, but really you have this dynamic and interactive space that goes beyond those hospital walls. Because we don't just want you to talk about these new ideas in healthcare, we want you to make them and make them real and hold them in your hands. Thank you.
So Anna, we have this organization with 1.3 million employees in this country. How do we embed a maker culture inside something as big and established as the National Health Service?
So starting by giving permission. So working and getting leadership to give them permission, and let's give them maker spaces. So part of it's a mindset and it's a tool set.
So it's not as simple as creating a space. You need to create a culture, don't you?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
So that starts with hospital leadership, granting both permission for these ideas to be prototyped and then even shared, and doing that in a way that happens before it reaches the unit, because once it reaches the unit, then everybody is afraid to share that information. But if there's a way to capture those ideas when they happen, then you can really start to amplify that.
And this idea of empowering people on the front line to make those decisions, to take those risks, that can be a challenge in a status-led organization like a hospital, where maybe some of the clinicians see the nurses as there to serve their needs more than the patient's needs. How do you confront that kind of thinking?
What's interesting is that you actually start to see that clinicians and physicians are one of the most people who encourage nurses to make the most, because it solves their problems faster. So it's almost, you want to be able to give permission and then also recognize who was the person who made it. So sometimes recognition can be a challenge as well. But if you're able to document and share that, then the team works more fluidly.
Well, Everyday Wired is getting excited about some new project on Kickstarter. It makes complete sense that maker mindset should embed the health sector. Thank you very much for coming over
Thank you.
from Boston. Anna Young.